couple of months ago, I made a turning saw with the great Uri Tuchman, and I have to be honest, it kind of came out great. The saw looks good and it works beautifully, and when it was done, Uri and I auctioned it off to charity. We raised $650 for St. Jude Children's Hospital. I gotta be honest, the whole thing was just perfect, except for one detail. Now, I don't own a turning saw, and you kind of need one. A turning saw is an essential tool for hand tool woodworking. It handles all sorts of complex curves and details, and it's much better than a coping saw. You've got a longer blade, a heavier frame, and you can put a lot more tension on the blade, so it just works better all around. Now, I really like the Gramercy bow saw blades made by Tools for Working Wood. These blades are a foot long and they are optimized for hand cutting, so they're much better than hacking up a bandsaw blade and trying to use that. Now, the last time we made a saw, we had Uri's amazing custom-made handles and pins. And this week, we're doing the Woodwork for Humans version, and we don't have that incredible hardware. But Gramercy also makes these nifty little brass pins for only $18. These things are beautifully machined. They're made to fit the blades that we're going to be using, and for 18 bucks, I mean, it seems like a no-brainer. We've gotta just buy these things, right? It only makes sense. Nah, we're just gonna make them out of random junk. This is me, after all. Making the pins and the handles is probably the most complicated part of this build. The pins are especially complicated. So you've got this tiny little blade right here, and the pin has to grip the end of this blade. It needs a slot for the blade to fall into. It needs to resist a ton of pulling force, and it needs to rotate through 360 degrees of travel. That's what makes it a turning saw. Now, if you're making your own pins, you might overlook this little flange right here. This part is actually crucial because it transfers the pulling force of the blade to the frame instead of the handle. If you're just pulling right on the handle, right on the pin, that's too much force. You're gonna pull it straight out eventually. What you need is for all of that force to be transferred to the arm, to the handle, which is made to take it. The handle itself is just there for the turning part, and the flange is important because it transfers that energy right to the frame. We can make some pins out of this 1/4-20 threaded rod. We'll also need a couple of nuts and some wide washers. I've got my threaded rod gripped in a couple pieces of scrap wood to protect my vise, and I can use a regular hacksaw to cut right down the middle. There are lots of measurements and details to this project. So I've got a set of plans, and I'll talk about those in a minute. I'm also coming in for this angled cut. That's going to hold the blade without any chance of it slipping out. After I cut the rod to length, I'll put on one nut, add a washer, and then thread on the second nut. Then I'm going to tighten the nuts against each other. This is called a jam nut, and it is not going to come apart. Now, my first pin is complete. I'll make a second one, and then it's onto the handles. I'm using maple here, and you want a dense, close-grained wood for the handle. First, I need a counterbore for that nut to slot into, and I'm doing that with a Forstner bit in my modern brace. I did a whole video about modern hand tool drilling last week, and you can check that out if you want to use all kinds of modern bits in a brace. Now, I need a hole for the threaded rod, and I've sized it so those threads can bite into the wood. Before I tighten the pin all the way down, I also add a dab of epoxy, and that's going to lock everything in place. Now, making handles is certainly easier with a lathe, and I plan to build a spring pole lathe this winter. But you can still make nice handles with bench tools. It just takes a little time. A good way to make a comfortable handle from square stock is to take off the corners and make an octagon. Then you can taper it from the midpoint down to one end. So after you've cut off the bulk of the waste with your saw, it's pretty easy to use a spoke shave and chisel to get a smooth shape with flat facets. Leave your handle attached to the stock for as long as you can. It gives you a lot more work holding options. Once you do cut it free, you can grip it by the pin and work on the back end. It's easy to drive yourself crazy trying to get perfect symmetry on something like this, but it's a handle for a tool. Make it comfortable. Mine came out looking pretty nice, but believe me, they're far from perfect. They won't give me blisters, and that's the important part. Once your pins and handles are done, that's like half the project. Now you can move on to making the frame. Now, when I made my saw with Uri, I was particularly happy with how the arms of my frame came out. I liked them so much, I made a pattern. And now I can make these as often as I want to. Now, I have plans for this build, and of course they've got all the measurements and everything, but more importantly, they've got a printable template, just like this. So you can print it out, cut it out, and then just trace it directly onto the wood. Like my little template here, the plans have a center line right through. That's going to help you align the grain of your wood so that it runs right up the middle of the piece. That's going to keep it really strong. I'm using oak for my arms. Most hardwoods will work, but you want something strong. Ash and maple would be good choices too. Historically, a lot of these saws were made out of more exotic woods. I copied my design from one made entirely out of ebony, which was very cool. Of course, you don't have to make the arms in this complex curved shape, but I've made a couple of these now, and I see why this basic style was used in turning saws throughout history. It does look nice, but that's only part of it. This design is ergonomic and balanced. It provides good attachment points for the handles, the string, and the stretcher. Even more importantly, this design eliminates waste wherever possible, so you end up with a light saw that's still stiff. The curves can be cut with basic tools, and that's a skill most of us need anyway. The outside curves can be cut with simple, bevel-up chisel cuts, getting closer to the line with each pass. The inside curves are possible because of these stop cuts I sawed into the waist. The chisel work is bevel down, and I'm just riding that bevel into the curve. You always have to worry about splitting, but as long as you work down to the center of the curve from each side, you'll be okay. With the waist removed, you can clean up and fair in those curves with a variety of files or rasps. These aren't fancy woodworking rasps, just off-the-shelf stuff that I find at garage sales and flea markets. I'll link to a couple of things down in the description. Of course, if you don't have good files or rasps, a bit of sandpaper on a stick works just about as well, especially for getting that final surface. I had to make 2 of these arms on a tight filming deadline, so I cut the second arm out on the bandsaw and just finished it by hand. When you've got your arms and you're happy with the general shape, you can drill them out for the pins. Now we just need the stretcher that's going to go in between the arms and give us a pivot point for tightening up that blade. Now, that stretcher has to be a very exact length, so it's a good idea to cut a test piece first. You can just use whatever junk wood is sitting around the shop. Cut a piece of scrap wood, and then trim it until you get a good length that fits snugly between the arms. Put a blade in the saw frame, and it'll be pretty easy to find the length of your stretcher. Wind a little string around the top of the frame, add a scrap for the toggle, and your test stretcher should stay in place just by friction. The saw works like this. You can test it and see if it cuts. I've got my temporary stretcher dialed in, and now I'm ready to cut the permanent part. This is the part of the build that can get a little bit tricky if you're a beginner. You need to join the stretcher to the arms so that it stays in place, especially when the saw isn't under tension. You also need a little bit of pivot at the joints. When I built my other saw, I used a little mortise and tenon joint. It's not that difficult to cut, but it is delicate and it needs a good fit. If you haven't done a lot of joinery, you might be intimidated, so we're going to make our saw with a more beginner-friendly technique. Instead of the mortise and tenon joint, we're going to join our stretcher to our arms with a bridle joint. It's U-shaped like this, and it's just going to slot over the arms like this. It is just as good as a mortise and tenon in an application like this, and it's much more forgiving. It's easier to cut. When you're picking the wood for the stretcher, think about weight. I used oak for the other parts, which is heavy, but I need the strength of a dense wood. The stretcher is different because it only has to resist compression. It's not going to bend or flex, and it doesn't need to be heavy. A good choice for this part is Douglas fir. It's used all around the Midwest for framing houses because it's so strong and light. In fact, this piece came out of an old roof rafter. It's really easy to work and has excellent straight grain. After I've got my stock dimensioned, I can just lay my arm right on top of it to get the measurements for the joint. I'm going for a tight fit. I can always trim it later. This joint is good practice for cutting tenons. It's the same thing in reverse. You leave the outside and take out the middle. I'm cutting down the cheeks with an inexpensive tenon saw. I have a whole video on how you can super tune it and get a really nice tool for about $40. I will link to that in the description. Now we just chop out the waist in the middle. The technique is simple. 2 chops down, and then a couple of angled chops in from the side to clear out waist and make room for the chisel. Go about halfway down on one side, then flip and keep chopping until the waist just pops out. Then you can do a little trimming. It's a lot like chopping out the waist between dovetails, so it's good practice. Once you have one end chopped, use your temporary stretcher to find the distance to your other shoulder. Mark it and chop it. Then you can test assemble the finished piece. My saw works fine, but it's heavy and kind of clumsy. I need to go back and find places where I can take out wood to lighten up the structure. The biggest problem is that stretcher. The bridle joint makes it extra wide and heavy, even though I used a light wood. Luckily, it's not hard to fix. I can rip a ½ inch of wood off one side, and that already makes a big difference. The ends are also too long, and they'll be more durable if I round them over. That's another quick fix. But the real secret weapon here is the stopped chamfer. Here's the layout. Draw two 45-degree angles across one corner and a long line all the way down the edge. Now, I'm just going to remove all the material between my layout lines. The trick here is this little stop cut just at the base of the 45-degree line. That lets me come in with a chisel and safely slice down the angle without too much danger of splitting below my layout lines. Because this is a long chamfer, I don't want to do everything with a chisel. That would take way too long. Instead, I'm going to flip that chisel bevel down and scoop out about an inch of waste. That gives me enough clearance to come in with my spoke shave and quickly take off all the material in the middle without accidentally cutting into the end. The spoke shave lets me come right down to my layout lines, and it leaves a clean surface. So once the spoke shave work is done, my chamfer is finished. After I've done this to all four corners of the stretcher, I've taken out a lot of weight. But I haven't reduced its strength because those outside corners aren't bearing much weight. Chamfers are used for looks or to keep sharp edges from splintering, but they're also a valuable way to get rid of excess mass. Practicing a skill like this on a tool is also low pressure. Learn how to do it now with something that will never leave your shop, and you'll get it right on your next piece of furniture. Man, that was a lot of details. Let's put this thing together. Assembly is simple. The stretcher goes between the arms. The pins go in and receive the blade. Wrap the top of the saw in 6 or 7 loops of good string and jam a piece of wood in between as the toggle. Wind it up until it feels pretty tight, and take a second to enjoy the thing you just made. Turning saws are pretty. I bet yours is going to be really pretty. These saws are also not difficult to use. If you have any trouble starting the cut, you probably don't have enough tension on the string. Give the toggle one full twist and try again. And make sure to let off one twist when you're done for the day. With good tension, the saw starts like butter, and those fine teeth chew right through this yellow pine. I can just freehand any crazy curve I want, and when I get into a little trouble, it's easy to just rotate the blade in the frame, and then I can cut sideways or even cut straight up towards myself if I need to. Even tight curves are no problem with a well-made turning saw. Tool making is really rewarding. I mean, you can make something like this and it's going to last you for years, maybe for the rest of your life. And every time you pick it up to cut apart, you can feel it and look at it and think, man, I made this and it looks good and it works well and it's going to help me make other things. It is unbelievably satisfying. It might be my favorite thing to do in the shop. And when you do it yourself, you can also save a lot of money. You can buy nice commercially made bow saws, a lot like this, and they cost $150 to $200. This saw, I've got like 20 bucks in this thing, and a day of very pleasant shop work. So for me, that's a good deal. Now, of course, I have a great set of plans for this, just like I always do, and it's got that printable template that's going to help you get those arms put together really easily. But I've got something even more important to tell you about. This week, I'm releasing my Journeyman's Plan Bundle. It is 6 of my most popular plans, all bundled together at a big savings to you. The bundle has my turning saw, of course, but also my saw vise, my miter box, my miter shooting board, my low Japanese sawhorses, and my Japanese cutting gauge. And when you buy all of them together, you save a lot of money. You save like over 50%. And if you're interested in that, you can click the link down in the description or go on over to rexkruger.com/store and get more details about what's included in that plan bundle. Of course, my patrons never have to think about what any of this stuff costs because they get all of my plans for free. They got the turning saw plans this morning, and they also got the complete plan bundle. And it's all included in the cost of membership. So if you'd like to get awesome rewards like that, go on over to patreon.com/rexkruger and check out all the things I do for the people who make this content possible. Oh, and even if you don't want to buy plans or be a patron or any of that stuff, I wouldn't be here at all without people watching my videos. My viewers make this stuff possible, and I never forget that. Thanks for watching.